Okay, tonight's online FoxPro user group is going to be Kevin Ragsdale, multi-threading with Visual FoxPro. Kevin's a frequent speaker, Southwest Fox, and you've seen him around all over the place with various articles. Kevin, go ahead and turn it over to you. Looks like we don't have much background noise or anything going on, so we'll just leave the microphones on. If anybody has a question from Kevin during the presentation, just go ahead and speak up, or you can type in the chat window and I'll grab you there. Over to you, Kevin.
All right, thanks, Todd. Thanks, everybody, for showing up tonight. My name's Kevin Ragsdale, and this is Easy Multi-Threading with Visual FoxPro. And down at the bottom here on this slide is the address to the source code files for the presentation. And that includes a white paper that I did for the Southwest Fox Conference a couple of years ago. And it's got a lot more detail in it than what the session will have, because this is kind of like a condensed session where I'm just going to kind of go right on through what we're going to talk about tonight. And basically, this is an introduction to creating multi-threaded applications using a DLL that Christoph had written called dmult.dll. And it helps if you know something about creating and debugging and deploying multi-threaded DLLs. Multi-threading, for me, it allows your app to do many things at once, and it really frees up your user interface, and you'll see some examples of that tonight. And basically, when you put those together, it allows your users to follow their workflows instead of following your app's workflow. And what I mean by that is if you've got a piece of your app that has like a really long running process, the user can't do anything until that process is complete. And we'll see some examples of that as well. There's several advantages to multi-threading, and you can probably tell by this slide that for me, it means responsiveness of your user interface. And I don't know if you guys have seen this or not. Has anybody ever seen that message pop up in any program? Like Windows Vista 7 and 8. If an application is not responding, or if Windows thinks it's not responding, it'll pop up this message for you. And, you know, it's not that big a deal when it says Microsoft Visual FoxPro is not responding. But what really, Scott can't hear. Can everybody else hear?
Yeah, I'm hearing you fine. I just have it turned up a bit.
Cool. Alrighty. If it's your application, say you've compiled an application and it's like, you know, the app that I just worked 6 months on, and it's not responding, that's what it's going to say up in that title bar. And this is what the user sees. Do you want to close the program or wait for it to respond? And in Windows 8, Microsoft actually added to that message, and they added a try to restore the program. And I can tell you from experience, if you've got a long-running process, say in a DLL that's running, and the user clicks try to restore the program, it kills that DLL that's running, so that your app becomes responsive again.
Kevin, can we have you try your microphone slider maybe?
So sure. Do I need to go up a little bit?
Yeah, it's on that phone button. Then there's
that.
That was louder.
A little better? How's
yeah,
that?
Yeah, that's coming in better.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Okay, with Visual FoxPro and multi-threading, I'm sure everybody probably already knows this. If you want to run Visual FoxPro code in a separate thread, you have to build a multi-threaded DLL. And we've been able to do that since one of the service packs back in Visual FoxPro 6. So we've had it around for a long time, which means, of course, we can build multi-threaded DLLs in Visual FoxPro. And I do a lot of development where I'll create a multi-threaded DLL and put it on a web server. And then I'll have ASP.NET instantiate the DLLs. And everything works great because it's all multi-threaded, it's blazingly fast and scalable as far as the web goes. But there's one big problem with this. Visual FoxPro will load the DLL in the same thread as the application that's calling it. So if you created a multi-threaded DLL and you call it from the Visual FoxPro IDE, it's going to load that DLL in the same thread that VFP is running in, which means it's not really multi-threaded. And it's the same thing if you've compiled an application in VFP and you've created a multi-threaded DLL to go with it. It's if you load it from your app, it's going to load in the same thread that your app is running. And sure enough, we've got a demo of that. So basically what I've got here is a project that I called Sample, and it contains one program. And basically all this is just a multi-threaded DLL that we're going to build. It's just an OLE public class with one method called SomeLengthyProcess. And it's going to accept a parameter of a callback object, which I'll get into in a few minutes. And basically all this code does is for 20 loops, it's going to print out to the Visual FoxPro window, hello OFUG, and then a just a sys 2015 string. Then it's going to sleep for 1 second and then go back and do it again. So the whole process should take 20 seconds to run, hence the name SomeLengthyProcess. When it gets done with those 20, it's just going to print out the word done to my Visual FoxPro window. So if I want this to be a multi-threaded DLL, I need to build it, and we'll select multi-threaded DLL. And I'll be honest with you guys, for what, 10 years almost, I would build a multi-threaded DLL and thought that I was building multi-threaded apps. And, you know, I was totally wrong. I'll put it that way. Now I've got a little function here called non-threaded. And basically what I'm going to do is instantiate the DLL that I just built. The DLL is sample, and the class was easy MT server. And then I'm going to call SomeLengthyProcess, and I'm going to send the underscore VFP as the callback object. So we'll run that right quick. And cool, there it goes. It's running. And you see my cursor is just that little circle spinning around. Check this out. Right now I'm clicking all over the screen. I can't do anything in FoxPro. And the reason I can't do anything in FoxPro is because even though FoxPro loaded that multi-threaded DLL, it loaded it in the same thread that Visual FoxPro was running in. So basically, it called it, and then Visual FoxPro had to wait until it was done. And then all of a sudden, you see a lot of the clicks that I did activated because the Windows message queue was getting loaded up with all these clicks that I was doing all over the screen when I did that. So, any questions so far? Okay, we'll jump back over here. Now, basically, if you want to load a multi-threaded DLL from a Visual FoxPro app or Visual FoxPro itself, you need what they call a helper utility. And at the time that I first did this session at Southwest Fox, there were 3 utilities that I knew of. There was one that Remus Rusano had written. Calvin Shaw had posted a blog post, and his actually used assembler code that you built on the fly in Visual FoxPro. And then, of course, there was Christoph's DMult DLL. Ever since I did the session at Southwest Fox, Rick Strahl has created a helper DLL, and also they've added a create thread object function to the VFP to C32 FLL, which is out on the VFPX site, vfpx.com. And from what I've heard from people that are using it, it's a really good one to use as well. For me, I started using Christoph's like 2 or 3 years ago, and it's just been so easy to use. That's what I stuck with. And so the DLL that Christoph wrote was written in C++, and it accepts a COM object or a string reference. So he's got 2 methods in this DLL. It was like create thread with object or create thread with string. In this session, I'm just going to use COM objects. And basically what the helper does is it creates a new thread and loads the COM server or the DLL that you're wanting to run into that thread so that it's actually totally separate from your app or Visual FoxPro. And basically what we're going to do is declare the function and send it 3 parameters. The COM server to load is basically the name of the DLL. In our example, it'll be sample. and then dot easymt server, which is the class name inside that DLL. Then you tell it the method that you want to run, and you can also pass in a callback object, which is sort of like an event handler. When the DLL gets done doing its thing, it can call back to your callback object, and then you can do whatever you want with that, with the information that you got back from the DLL. So this time we're going to run the demo again, and you can see sample main. It's the exact same project that we just ran a minute ago. Sample main. I don't want to remove it, but I'm just going to go ahead and rebuild it for fun. You don't actually have to do this. I'm just doing it as an example, I guess. Now, to build the DLLs and have them register on your machine as a developer, you have to be running Visual FoxPro as an admin if you're on Vista, Windows 7, or Windows 8. And basically what I do is, for my shortcut for Visual FoxPro, I've got it set to always run as administrator. So every time I start Visual FoxPro, I get the little Windows message, to elevate it as an administrator. And that just helps me get it done a little bit quicker. And we're going to run this function here called multithreaded. And you can see here, we're going to do the declare that I was talking about earlier. We're going to declare a create thread with object in DLL. Now, the way I've written it here, with no path information or anything like that, DLL has to be located by my program. Basically, I've got it sitting in the same folder as this program, so it's going to find it right off the bat. There's also a Windows API function that Christoph uses called close handle. And basically what I'm going to do is call his create thread with object. I'm going to pass in the DLL and the class, the method I want to run, and the callback object. And remember, the callback from earlier was just the underscore VFP so that I could print things to the screen. And that's what we're going to send this time as well. So I'm going to close my project, and let's run multi-threaded. There it goes. It starts printing to OFUG. But here's what's interesting. I got control back to the program. I can do anything I want while it's running. And if I do this fast enough, there you go. You can see what I just typed in the command window actually showed up in the middle of all the strings from the DLL. I could have opened the class browser. I could have done, modified a different program while this DLL was running in the background. Basically, as soon as I fired off that DLL, I was able to do anything that I wanted to within Visual FoxPro. And by extension, I would be able to do anything that I wanted to do inside of my own apps that I create with FoxPro. We'll get ready for the next demo. There's a couple of things about the parameters that you send to the DLL. And most important is that the server name and method name have to be sent in as Unicode. And that's pretty easy to do with FoxPro. You just use the string convert method. You send in your server name, which is basically the DLL name, and your class. And then I terminate it with the char0, just a null character. And we use the parameter of 5 to convert that string to Unicode. And that's for the DLL. We do the same thing with the method that we want to run. And it's pretty important to realize that you have to send a COM reference to the DLL for your callback object. But what's pretty cool is you can take any Visual FoxPro object and create a COM reference for it by applying underscore VFP.eval to your object. Once you do that, it actually creates a COM reference for you. And that's what we'll pass in the later demos. So I could create a callback that's just a custom class or a session class or whatever. But I could also have a callback that was a text box on a form. So I would create a VFP reference of this form, the text box, in this case, text URL. And then I would do the underscore VFP eval, and that will create a COM reference that I'm going to pass to Christoph's DLL. And all of that is explained a little bit better in the white paper. Now I'm going to jump over to what I call the Visual Foxy Feed Reader Pro application. And if anybody's ever read any blog posts that I've done or seen the sessions about ugly FoxPro programs and stuff, I don't like the word visual or Fox in programs because I don't want people to know that I wrote the program in Visual FoxPro. Because if people Google Visual FoxPro, usually there can be some kind of negative connotation to it these days. Now, in this example, I've got another multi-threaded DLL, and this one's going to be called blog stuff. And what this DLL is going to do, I guess I should open the program first. It's just one program, and you can see it's an OLE public session class. In this case, I'm going to use Craig Boyd's VFP connection FLL, which Craig did a great job with that. It uses the libcurl library to do HTTP and FTP and all that good stuff. And basically what I'm going to do is create a multi-threaded version or multi-threaded HTTP component using his FLL as the communications protocol for it. I've got a function in here called getBlogs, and what I'm going to do is call my web server. It's just a page, it's just an ASP.NET page with his FLL. I'm going to say, hey, give me these blogs, and it's going to send it back. And when it gets done, it's going to call the process blogs method of my callback object. And it's going to send back the HTTP string that it gets from the web server. And at that point, it will be done. And then it will just go and destroy itself. And what I've got here, well, this one's actually going to be the single threaded version of it. What I'm going to do is click a button that says get the blogs. It says from Planet Fox, but it's actually calling my web server. I'm going to do that. And that's actually pretty fast. It found 35 blogs. And on my web server, I've got, if it'll come up, probably won't. What I've got is a FoxPro DLL that will open a FoxPro table that has these blogs. Then it creates a JSON string and sends it back. And then my handler takes care of going through the JSON string. And that was pretty fast. We got 35 really quickly, and it was that multi-threaded DLL. Now I want to get all the authors of each of these blogs. I just want somebody's name or the title of the blog. So I'm going to click that, and it's going to call each one of these URLs and get the names. It's pretty quick. It's not too bad. But you can see right away that there's my cursor again, and I can't do anything. I'm clicking all over. I can't move my window. I click the cancel button. Nothing happens. I'm clicking in the grid. Nothing's happening. And what I was really hoping for was that you would see the not responding message. So Windows is actually playing nice with me right now. But you can see it's still just plugging away there. And it's done. And here's what's funny. It took 34 seconds for that to complete. But what happened was, since I had hit the cancel button, that message had queued up in the Windows queue, so that when Visual FoxPro got control back from the DLLs, it said, hey, Windows, go ahead and process this message queue. And it said, oh, we had to click on cancel, so it closed that form before you could actually see how long it took. But you can see there that once I started that process, there was nothing I could do. I just had to wait until basically it was done doing what it was doing. Now I've also got a multi-threaded version that calls the same DLL, but this time, instead of instantiating the DLL and saying, hey, go get the author for this blog, blah, 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 this one is going to act a little different. We're going to scan through that table after we get back all of the web addresses. It's going to scan through them, and for each one, it's going to create a callback object, and it's going to add it to a collection. And I'll only do this because I like to keep count of how many threads I have running on the screen. And then for each one, we're going to use Christoph's demult DLL to create a new thread and throw in the blog retriever class, get author, and then it does a VFP eval of my callback object. And I believe I've got, here we go. This is my callback object, which is nothing but a custom class. And it's got one property called CURL, and we're going to set that up when we create the object. When I do that, the DLL will be able to call back to the callback and say, hey, what's your URL that you want me to check? So it's a good way to actually communicate back and forth with the multi-threaded DLL that's running. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing, and this is basically the same form. We're just going to go out and get those blogs. And remember, the last one took about 35 seconds for it to go through the whole list. I'm going to bring up Task Manager as well. And this is all running under this VFP 9 process. And right now, VFP has 6 threads open. If you keep an eye on that, 43, 34, you can see it counting down up here in the button. And it's done. It took less than 7 seconds for that to run. But I think what's really cool about that, when it's running, if I click Get Authors again, I can click the Cancel button. Hey, you clicked Cancel. I can come over here and do anything that I want to do in my app, which in this case is FoxPro. And of course, this time it ran faster because it's probably cached some of those requests that came through the first time. Any questions so far?
Kevin, what happens if your callback object disappears?
Well, if the callback object disappears, the DLL just stops doing what it's doing. That's kind of important, is to make sure that you keep the scope available of the callback objects. But normally when I create a callback object, it sits. And I mean, it'll sit there as long as my app runs until the DLL, in this case, I'm going to jump down to the get author method. When it gets its result back, it calls my callbacks process result method. And as soon as it does that, the DLL dies. The callback processes the result. And what we're doing in that callback, let me bring up the handler again, which is just that custom class. There's my process result method. It gets the string back, which is really just a web page. And then it kind of digs through. It's looking for an author name or the title of the page.
Mm-hmm.
And then it updates my cursor. And then as soon as it updates the cursor, then the grid gets updated with everything. One important thing to do, though, is when you're done processing your result from the DLL, the callback should release itself, because otherwise you're going to end up with this dangling object just hanging out there. So what I do when I write out code, when I code a class, I always add a release method, and I just add release this in that method. So then when I'm done with process result, I always make sure I call this release, and then it goes through and releases itself. And that was one of the things that I did on that form that I just showed a minute ago, where I had a collection set up. I'm going to jump into a init. I had there's a property on the form code called OCall for collection. And basically I just create an empty collection. And when I created the callbacks in this method, while I was scanning through that table real fast, and actually I'm in the wrong spot here. Get authors. Here we go. When I created my callback, I added the callback to the collection. And what's really cool with having that collection is that at any time I can call the collection and say, how many threads have I got? Because all I got to do is say, what's your count of the collection? And it'll be like 47, then 32, then 28. When you release your callback object with the release this, it's automatically removed from the collection. As soon as it goes out of scope, it's out of the collection as well. The collection takes care of losing it for you. You don't have to go back and manage the collection. And the way I kept track of that on this form was I just added a little timer. And of course, I start out with it disabled, and I've got it set to what, about an 8, 125 milliseconds. So it'll fire about 8 times per second. And there's no code in the timer method, as you can see. But what I did in the init method of the form was I did a bind event. Every time the timer fires, call update thread count on the form. So every 125 milliseconds, it calls this and says, hey, collection, what's your current count? And then it updated the caption on that cancel button where it was counting down those threads. Then once it got down to 0, I knew I was done. And I switched the caption to done and then showed how many seconds it took to go through the whole process. But I think the most important thing for me, though, when I'm doing the multi-threaded stuff is the fact that I've got access to FoxPro and my app immediately after I make those calls, which can be pretty powerful stuff. If we go back to the callbacks, there are event handlers, callbacks. You can call them whatever you want. It can be any Visual FoxPro object that you want it to be. It could be an empty class. It can be a custom, a session. It could be a form. It could be an object on a form. It could even be, if you use a global application object, you could add methods to that and use that as your callback. It really helps if you add properties and methods to extend the functionality, and I'll show that in the next demo, where I add several different properties to it, and I also have several different methods in the callback that the DLL knows about, and it calls them at various times. As always, error checking and handling is pretty important when you're doing this kind of stuff. And if you go through a lot of my code, you'll just see try, catch, and try. So that's my error handling. So I usually tell people the way I take care of bugs in FoxPro is I set bugs off and set errors off. And then if I want to work longer during the day, I set hours to 36 instead of 24. So. And I just learned it's really hard to tell a joke online when you don't hear anybody. So this demo that I'm going to do here is I'm going to do 100 simultaneous web requests from this Visual FoxPro form. And basically, I'm calling my server 100 times. For all intents and purposes, I'm about to do a DNS raid on my server. So I hope I don't have too many customers hitting the server right now. But I'm going to create a DLL called domain names. And once again, you can see it's just an OLE public session class. And I actually threw in a bunch of string to files on this one so that when it runs, after it gets through running, I'm going to go back and read this little text file to see what all happened as it went along. And this one's going to use Craig Boyd's FLL again. It's got a method called getDomain, and it accepts the callback. And then I did do a couple of things where I'll put it to sleep several times throughout the run so that I'm not absolutely killing my server. But you can see here, right off the bat, it calls a method on the callback object called onQueued. And then it sleeps for a second or so. And then it calls a method called onRetrieving. Then it sleeps for a little while. Then it actually looks at a property of the callback object and says, okay, I'm going to use this, and I'm going to call the web server and use that as a parameter on this particular page as a query string. Then it actually makes the request. When it gets everything back, it'll call a method called onProcessing on the callback object, and then eventually we'll get down to the end, and we're going to call process result on the callback. Once the callback's done with process result, the DLL is just going to fade away. When you're using actual multi-threaded DLLs, once it does its job, it doesn't stick around. You know, like if I created it, if I instantiated it by saying LODLL equals create object, this DLL dot this class, that's going to stay in scope until I actually null it out or release it. But when it's multi-threaded, once it's done its thing, once it's run that one method, it's done and it goes away. And what I do here is, well, I'm just going to write the word destroy and do the name of this particular object and write it out to a file. My callback object is here, and this one's a little more complicated than the other one because I added some properties to it, and that even those properties even include this Microsoft Internet Explorer web browser control that we're going to use. It's called OWeb, and when I create the handler, I'm going to set that property of OWeb. And the reason I'm going to do that is that the handler is going to take care of updating the web page for me. So the DLL is doing its work, and it's going to call back to the callback, and then the callback is actually going to update a table and update the web page for me on the fly. So I set all those properties there, and our process result method, I'm not going to walk through this whole method, but it's basically when you're processing the result, if I didn't get anything back, I'm gonna update the web page and just have it say error. So, and then if we did actually get things back, I'm going to change graphics on the page so you can see either green or red. And here's where I added those additional functions on queued and on retrieving that I was calling from the DLL back to the callback. When the DLL calls on queued, it says, hey, update the web page. So basically it's going to update the web page. So when the DLL says on queued, we're going to update the web page with the word queued. And then later when it's on retrieving, we're going to say retrieving. And processing is the same way. So, and then of course I've got the release method, and I should have a this release somewhere in process result. So I'm going to go ahead and run the form. And basically I've got this table called domains, and it's just got a bunch of phrases in it. And I want to call my web server for each one of these phrases and say, hey, give me the status on these. Tell me if the domain name is available or not. And in this case, I'll go ahead and bring up the task manager again so you can kind of watch that. You can see right now I'm using about 16 megs of memory, and there's 14 threads running in FoxPro. I believe there's 102 domains here. When I hit that, you can see it's all updating as it goes along, and at one point it got up to 121. My memory got really high there for a second. Of course, once all the DLLs were done and all the callbacks were released, the memory went back down again. But that was pretty quick, and that hit the server 102 times just within like 3 or 4 seconds. And if I go out and see the text file that I created during that run. Basically what happened was during the init method for the DLL, I created just a temporary name for it and set library to and wrote it out to a file. And you can see how fast that was. It started at 8:10 and 51 seconds. And I was already getting callbacks, within that first second. So or calling the get domain method of the callback. And then eventually, as we get along through here, it's still firing off things. And this all happened within like 2 or 3 seconds. And then the destroys started firing. So as the DLL got done with its job, it destroyed itself and went out of scope. And you see that they pretty much all destroyed within a couple of seconds of one another. Now, there are some disadvantages to using multi-threaded DLLs in Visual FoxPro, and the biggest one is that every thread is a new instance of the VFP runtime, and that's one reason why you saw the memory take off on that last demo that I did. Another downside of using a new instance of the VFP runtime is that things like variables, global objects, global variables, work areas, and data sessions, that instance of the runtime knows nothing about what your application is doing. So you can't have your customers table open and then call a multi-threaded DLL and say use, or say, here's the customer's table, do something with it, because the DLL has no idea about the customer's table because it can't see it. What you can do if you want to pass data back and forth is you can always do a cursor to XML in your app, pass the XML to the DLL, and then it can do XML to cursor, manipulate some data, cursor to XML, and send it back to the app. It sounds complicated. It sounds like it would actually take a long time, but it is blazingly fast when you do stuff like that. There's more disadvantages, and the biggest one there for me is the different projects. Every single DLL that I'm creating is a new project. And even though that project may only have one PRG file, it can get difficult sometimes if you end up with a gigantic app and you've got 7 or 8 or 10 multi-threaded DLLs that you may be using. That's 7, 8, or 10 different projects in addition to your application project. It's also harder to debug a multi-threaded DLL because you can't really see into it unless you do things like the string to file that I do. That's my method of debugging DLLs. I typically do a bunch of string to files and then I walk along and see what it did. There's a lot more planning involved up front when you're using the multi-threaded. And the funny thing is that there's already a lot of planning involved when you're doing a new application. So I don't know about you guys, but I don't have a whole lot of time for planning. So that can be a sticking point sometimes. If I want to extend some functionality in my app, sometimes I may not be able to do it simply because I don't have the time to sit down and plan it out right. And another thing is that it uses the multi-threaded runtime for Visual FoxPro, which is that VFP 9T DLL. And it's a lightweight runtime, but it's different than the normal Visual FoxPro runtime. And I think the biggest difference is that most of the user interface stuff is taken out of the lightweight one, which really shouldn't be that big a deal because you can't have a user interface in your DLL anyway. And then we'll get to, this will be my show us your apps session, I guess. My demos are like, you try to think of something like, wow, what's going to run fast and what's going to run slow, but I'm not really showing anything real world. So I'm going to show you an app that I wrote in FoxPro, and this is called Micro Niche Finder. And I originally wrote it about 6 years ago, and it's gone through several overhauls throughout the last few years. But while that splash screen was running, I actually fired off about 5 or 6 different multi-threaded DLLs and created callback objects. And then when the DLLs were done, it was passing information back to the callbacks. One of those things is this area here, the client testimonials. And I've got a SQL Server table on the web server. And basically, I instantiated a multi-threaded DLL and said, call the web server and get testimonials. And when the testimonials came back, it updated a testimonials table that's local on the machine. So now every time I click the web page or the home page, it'll load just a random record from that testimonials table. And another thing that was multi-threaded was activation. Since we sell this program, it's like a consumer-based software that we sell on the internet. You have to be worried about people stealing it and sharing it and all that good stuff. So we built in activation, but also do a multi-threaded validation to say, here's my activation information, and it calls my server in the background. It basically calls home every time you start the program and says, hey, here's my activation information. Am I still good? Because some people may have gotten a refund, some people may have canceled a trial and things like that. So if you fail the validation, the program kicks into what we call reduced functionality mode, where you can do most of the things in the program, but a few things you can't. And this interface here is a command bars library. I don't know if anybody's ever used that from ARG software. It is really cool, and it gives you a full-blown ribbon control for your app. The rest of the page here is just a Microsoft web browser control. And then the status bar down at the bottom is also part of the command bars library. And what I've done is I've got a search here that I did earlier. And You can see there's some data here for the search results, but there's also several areas where we don't have the data yet. So what I'm going to do is just, I've got 17 total results. I'm going to check from this point. And so I've got all these checked records here. And then I'm going to click these buttons and add them to a queue. And what the queue does is adds them to a queue table. And then I've got timer controls that run through the queue timers or the queue tables. And all of these are making multi-threaded requests all at the same time in the background. And I can go back to the home page. I can go back to Visual FoxPro. I can go to my queues and actually watch the countdown, you know, as they change. Or I could just go back to my search screen. And for the ones I didn't check, I can just start checking them. Every single one of those is instantiating a new multi-threaded DLL, and everything's working in the background and coming back and giving me more information. So hopefully I can do it without it dying on me here. But the domain availability is basically calling GoDaddy API saying, hey, is this domain name foxpro.com, foxpro.org, foxpro.net, are they available? And when it comes back to the callback, it says, no, they're not available. So the callback function is updating the table that's underlying this web page, the data table actually, and then it also updates the web page as it goes along. So I thought it'd be kind of cool to show that in action, because the way this program used to do all of these queued items is if I added, say, this column, the SOC, if I added those to a queue, it would pop up a modal window. And it would make one request and get it back. And then it would make the next one and get it back. And then the next one. So you can imagine if you had 100 results. And here's a callback here. Google has said, hey, you've been calling me too much here, so I want to see that you're human. And my callback object has actually downloaded this CAPTCHA image in the background and prompted me. And when that window comes up, it kills the timer so that I don't end up having like 10 outstanding requests waiting for a CAPTCHA to come back. So you can see there, it bounced to the next one. Once I passed the CAPTCHA, Google decided it was okay and it let me go on to the next one. But anyway, that's it was a vast improvement over a modal window that could be sitting up there for 5, 6, 7 minutes, and the user couldn't do anything until it was done. And even if it had been a modeless window, while those requests were firing off and you're waiting for this long-running request to come back from a website, your app is not responsive. And I think that that's one of the best parts of the multi-threaded stuff. So basically, to wrap up, multi-threaded Visual FoxPro apps are possible. And if you use Christoph's demult DLL, it's very easy to integrate that into your own apps. And I'll bring this back up in case, you know, if you want to go, if you want to download the white paper and some of the sample code, it's at kevinragsdale.net/easymultithreading.zip. And like I said, that's going to have a lot more explanation than what you would see in an online demo. And if you have any questions, you can always feel free to email me, Kevin at kevinragsdale.net. I'm usually pretty good at responding to emails. I've got a blog at kevinragsdale.net, and I do that occasionally, but I tweet frequently. So if you're on Twitter, I'm just at Kevin Ragsdale on Twitter. And Todd, I think that does it for me, unless somebody has any questions.
Thanks, Kevin. We'll see if any questions come in. I'm curious where the extra speed is coming from. You would think going out, starting a new process, having to call back, communicate between the two, have the process shut down would be slower.
No, they're incredibly fast. I think the biggest speed difference, if I go back to, say, the first example that I did, not the first example. We're going to come back to this one. This is the one where I'm just instantiating Actually, I'm not even instantiating the DLL in this case. I'm just using VFP connection and going through the table and making an HTTP call, and it has to wait until that response comes back. There's nothing else I can do in that app, and that creates the slowness in that case. The DLL stuff, it amazes me. This thing that I just uncommented right there, the do events force, if you're in a tight loop like this, I find that if you put a do events force inside the tight loop, Visual FoxPro will be much better at capturing those clicks on the buttons. Like earlier when I was clicking the cancel button and nothing happened. When you do events force, it basically says, hey, Windows, I'm going to give up for a minute, process your message queue. And then Windows would come back and say, hey, click the cancel button. Let's do something. I left out the do events force because it's just not good for a demo. You know, I wanted to show it's so slow when you do it this way, but when you do it that way, it's amazingly fast. One other reason why it's so fast is that I've got a quad core PC, and even though I'm running in a virtual machine, you know, I've got like 8 gigs of RAM and, you know, this quad core machine, everything's faster these days. So, but the DLL stuff amazes me at how fast it is. FoxPro to this day still amazes me at how fast it is, especially with string manipulation.
Yeah, that was quick. Reports is another place I can see it being really worthwhile. I mean, it seems to be that's the
That's
slow thing for me.
that's the number one question I got from people at Southwest Fox was, hey, could I do this with reports? And you could. And the biggest thing I think would be the data crunching.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
you know, technically speaking, you know, I mean, if you've got enough memory, um, you know, you could create a bunch of temporary cursors and just, you know, do a cursor to XML, pass those off to the DLL, and it's going to be crunching on a different thread. And then you would just pass that information back to FoxPro and say, all right, do my report.
Yeah. Cool. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I guess we're all done. Thanks, Kevin.